Imagine this. America is half asleep. Television's glowing in the dark. Johnny Carson smiling behind the desk. The curtain opens, and a legend stumbles out. Slurred words, unsteady legs, eyes that don't quite focus. This isn't an act. This is live television. What happens when Hollywood's biggest names lose control on the safest stage in America? And which moments were so chaotic they were buried before anyone could talk? Tonight, we uncover the nights The Tonight Show crossed from entertainment into danger.
Would you welcome Dean Martin?
How you been, Joey?
When fame, alcohol, and live TV collided in ways no one was prepared for. Number 1. Dean Martin. Dean Martin built his entire persona around the idea of being permanently buzzed.
Bob, of course, has his special this coming Sunday night, which is at 8 o'clock. But following you
We have Dean.
is another special.
The drink in his hand, the slightly slurred delivery, the effortless cool of a man who seemed to be having the best time at a party that never ended. On his own variety show, it worked beautifully. But The Tonight Show was a different animal. And under Johnny Carson's tighter format, the cracks in Dean's performance started to show in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Dean would walk out from behind that curtain with a drink already in his hand, and the audience would cheer because that was the Dean Martin they expected.
No, when I drink, I drink. That's all I gotta say.
Well, that's real nice of you.
But once he sat down, something felt off. He stumbled over setups. He slurred punchlines that should have landed perfectly. Sometimes he greeted Johnny like they had never met before, calling him by the wrong name entirely. The audience laughed at first because they were trained to laugh at Dean Martin. Then slowly, person by person, they realized this wasn't an act anymore. Johnny tried everything to keep the segments afloat. He tossed Dean easy questions that any professional could hit in their sleep. Instead of playing along, Dean would cut him off mid-sentence, drift into half-finished stories, or suddenly stand up and wander toward the band like he had forgotten the cameras were rolling. He mixed up movie titles. He forgot which project he was promoting. He would stop talking mid-sentence, as if the thought had simply fallen out of his head. The producers started building extra padding into the schedule whenever Dean was booked. They knew his segments could run long, stall out completely, or require emergency commercial breaks at any moment. The legend was still there in flashes. Those moments when the old Dean Martin magic would surface and remind everyone why he was one of the biggest stars in the world. But now, every appearance felt like a coin flip. You never knew if you were getting Dean Martin the entertainer or a man visibly losing his grip on the persona that had made him famous. The drink in his hand stopped being a prop. It started looking like a lifeline. Number 2. Ed McMahon. This one shocked people because Ed McMahon was supposed to be the steady one. For decades, he sat in that sidekick chair as Johnny's right-hand man, the reliable presence who never made mistakes, never upstaged the host, never did anything to disrupt the carefully calibrated chemistry that made The Tonight Show work. Ed was the Rock. Until one night when Joan Embry came on from the San Diego Zoo, and Ed McMahon was visibly, undeniably intoxicated. It started with a simple introduction. Joan Embry had been appearing on the show for years, bringing exotic animals that delighted audiences.
Exotic animal specialist Joan Embry had Johnny ducking when she brought along this brand new emu.
And gave Johnny opportunities for genuine surprise and comedy. But instead of smoothly introducing her, Ed got fixated on exactly how many years she had been coming on the show. Was it 7 years? 8 years? 9 years? He kept arguing with Johnny about it, insisting he was right even when he was clearly wrong.
I don't know. Is it feels?
Was there a change made? No.
Not that we know of.
Yeah, there must have been.
Circling back to the same point over and over like a record skipping. Johnny tried steering back to the actual segment. He needed to get Joan out there with her animals before the whole thing derailed completely. but Ed kept drifting into slurred anecdotes about baby lions that made absolutely no sense. He would start a story, lose the thread, pick up a different story, lose that one too. Carson kept trying to regain control. He gently teased Ed about needing a nap. He asked him to snap out of it. Nothing worked. Ed alternated between defensive and weirdly sentimental, getting emotional for no apparent reason, then snapping back to confusion about what he had said just moments earlier. Throughout the entire mess, Ed kept interrupting Joan's introduction. Every time Johnny tried to bring her out and save the segment, Ed would jump in with another rambling comment. Finally, Johnny had enough. He cut Ed off firmly and asked to bring Joan out immediately. It became one of the rarest Tonight Show moments in history. The night when the normally polished Ed McMahon appeared completely off his rhythm, forcing Johnny Carson into damage control mode on his own show. Number 3, Truman Capote. Truman Capote was one of the most celebrated authors in American history. He wrote In Cold Blood.
Truman Capote is one of our great quintessential 20th century writers, best known perhaps for Breakfast at Tiffany and In Cold Blood.
A book that redefined nonfiction. By 1980, he had a serious problem with alcohol and pills, and when he arrived at The Tonight Show that year, he delivered one of the most uncomfortable interviews in television history. He could barely walk to the guest chair. His feet shuffled across the stage like he was moving through water. He steadied himself on Johnny's desk before attempting to sit down, then collapsed into the chair rather than lowering himself into it. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. Johnny greeted him warmly, hoping that once the interview started, it would not be as bad as it looked. It was worse, much worse. Capote slurred almost every word that came out of his mouth. Most of what he said was completely unintelligible. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching one of America's greatest literary minds struggle to form basic sentences. Johnny asked about his latest writing project. Capote launched into a bizarre story about a party in the Hamptons and someone's dog. Nobody could follow it. He would start a sentence and forget where it was going halfway through, then start a different sentence and forget that one too. His thoughts were scattered fragments that never connected to anything. Then, out of nowhere, Capote turned toward Ed McMahon and asked if he could sit in his lap. Dead serious. No setup, no joke, just a genuine request to climb into the sidekick's lap on national television. Ed laughed nervously. Johnny tried to redirect the conversation. Capote grabbed a glass of water and nearly missed his mouth entirely. The rim hit his chin. Water spilled down his shirt. He did not notice. The audience was frozen. This was not funny drunk. This was scary drunk. This was watching someone fall apart in real time. After about 7 agonizing minutes, Johnny called for an early commercial break. When they came back, he gave Capote 2 more minutes, then ended the segment. Capote shuffled back through the curtain. He was never invited back. The clip became infamous. A Pulitzer Prize-worthy author showed up so wasted he could barely sit upright on national television. Truman Capote died 4 years later. Number 4. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was a 2-time Academy Award winner and a complete nightmare when she had been drinking.
Thank you very much, members of the Academy, for giving this to me the 2nd time in my life.
Her 1974 appearance was legendary chaos, the kind of television disaster people still talk about 50 years later. From the second Shelley walked through that curtain, she was a hurricane. She interrupted Johnny constantly, talking over him like he wasn't even there. There were 2 other guests booked that night, people with projects to promote, careers on the line, and Shelley made it absolutely impossible for either of them to say a single word. She ignored every question Carson asked and went off on unrelated rants about people nobody in the audience had ever heard of. Names from her past, old grudges, stories that went nowhere. One of the other guests was a young actor trying to promote his first major film. This was the biggest night of his career, his chance to introduce himself to millions of viewers. Shelley turned to him, grabbed his knee hard, and started mocking his movie on national television. She tore it apart, said it was boring, said his performance was wooden. The poor guy sat there frozen with this horrified smile plastered on his face, unable to defend himself because every time he tried to speak, Shelley talked over him. Johnny tried to intervene, tried to defend the actor, but Shelley was not listening to anyone. Then she noticed the note cards on Johnny's desk, the questions written by the writers, the road map for the entire interview. Shelley reached across, snatched the entire stack right out of Johnny's hands, and threw them behind her over the couch. Just tossed them like garbage. The cards scattered across the floor behind the set. Carson sat there speechless. In all his years of hosting, he had never had a guest do that before. The audience gasped audibly. Shelley kept talking like nothing had happened, like throwing a host's notes across the stage was a perfectly normal thing to do. Finally, after about 12 excruciating minutes, Johnny gave up completely. He looked at the camera and announced they were taking an early commercial break. After the show, NBC producers blacklisted Shelley Winters. They called her agent and made it clear she was not welcome back. The ban lasted nearly 3 years. When she was finally allowed to return, someone had a serious conversation with her about showing up sober and not attacking other guests. Number 5. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was perhaps the greatest filmmaker in American history.
Orson Welles, a legend in the world of film whose work remains a benchmark in artistic excellence.
He directed Citizen Kane at 25 years old and spent the rest of his life trying to live up to that impossible standard. He was also a legendary drinker, and his Tonight Show appearances reflected both sides of that equation. When Orson was good, he was absolutely brilliant, one of the most captivating guests Johnny ever had. When Orson was drunk, he was still captivating, just completely impossible to control. His 1975 visit was the most out of control. Crew members saw him drinking wine in his dressing room before the show. When he walked out onto the stage, you could tell he was tipsy, but he was also Orson Welles, eloquent and brilliant, and completely intoxicated all at once. Johnny asked him one question, and Orson launched into a 14-minute monologue without stopping. He started with Shakespeare analysis that was genuinely insightful, the kind of intellectual depth that made you understand why this man was considered a genius. Then he detoured into his own career without warning. Then back to theater history. Then off into some random anecdote about a Hungarian director nobody had heard of. The connections existed only in Orson's wine-soaked mind. At one point, Orson tried to quote Hamlet. He got 3 lines in, forgot the actual Shakespeare, and started making up completely new lines that sounded Shakespearean but were entirely his own invention. He delivered them with total confidence, like he was performing at the Old Vic instead of rambling on a talk show couch. Johnny sat there exhausted, waiting for any opportunity to jump in with a question or a redirect. Orson never gave him one. 14 straight minutes of uninterrupted monologue. Carson glanced at the camera with that look that said he had completely lost control of his own show. The strange thing was, the audience loved it. Even wasted, Orson Welles was more interesting than most guests sober. There was no structure, no coherent through line, just a genius on wine talking about whatever came into his head on live television. Despite everything, Johnny kept inviting him back. Because when Orson Welles was at his best, there was nobody better. You just never knew which version was going to walk through that curtain. Number 6. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed holds a unique distinction on this list. He is the only person who almost appeared on The Tonight Show,
This is the first time we've had him on the show, or at least we've had a chance to meet. Would you welcome, please, Oliver Reed?
but never made it on air because Johnny Carson watched the tapes and refused to take the risk. Reed was a rising movie star in the early 1970s, a legitimate talent with a growing following in Hollywood. He should have been exactly the kind of guest The Tonight Show wanted. Young, charismatic, promoting a new film. But Oliver Reed had a reputation that preceded him. NBC executives had seen his recent appearances on other talk shows, and what they saw was terrifying. Reed had threatened to drop his pants on air during one interview. He had insulted hosts directly to their faces. He had demanded alcohol during tapings and become visibly aggressive when refused. On at least one occasion, things had gotten physical. The man was not just unpredictable when drunk, he was potentially dangerous. The executives showed Johnny the tapes. He sat there watching Oliver Reed melt down on other programs, watching him become someone who could not be controlled. And Johnny made a decision he rarely made in 30 years. He canceled the appearance entirely. Oliver Reed was never allowed on The Tonight Show during Johnny Carson's entire run. Reed mocked Carson publicly afterward, called him scared, called him uptight, said he was too afraid to have a real man on his show. Johnny never responded. He had seen enough chaos from guests over the years to know when someone was beyond managing. Oliver Reed was not worth the risk. Some people could be charming disasters. Oliver Reed was just a disaster waiting to happen, and Johnny Carson was not going to let it happen on his stage. Number 7. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole was one of the greatest actors of the 20th century. The man who played Lawrence of Arabia with such intensity that the role became inseparable from his identity.
Over my shoulder here, a scene from that great movie and the legendary actor, Peter O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia.
He was also legendary for his drinking, and his Tonight Show appearances could go either way, depending on what kind of afternoon he had before arriving at the studio. His 1978 visit delivered both genius and madness in equal measure. He arrived after heavy afternoon drinking. You could smell it on him. Johnny asked about Lawrence of Arabia, the obvious opening question. Instead of answering, O'Toole ignored the question and launched into a lecture on acting technique. It was brilliant, insightful stuff. Then, suddenly, it spiraled into confused rambling. Then back to brilliant. Then rambling again. His mind was pinballing between coherence and chaos. At one point, O'Toole grabbed Johnny's pen off the desk and turned it into a fencing foil. He forced Johnny into an impromptu fencing lesson right there on camera, thrusting and parrying like they were on a soundstage instead of a talk show set. Johnny was laughing, but also clearly trying to regain control of his own show. Then O'Toole launched into wild drinking stories about his friend Richard Harris. Stories that probably should not have been told on national television. Tales of destruction and debauchery that made the producers very nervous. But here's the thing about Peter O'Toole. Even when he was a complete mess, he was somehow charming. The audience loved him. Johnny loved him despite the chaos. He kept getting invited back because a drunk Peter O'Toole was still more interesting than most sober guests could ever hope to be. Number 8. Foster Brooks. Foster Brooks built his entire career on playing drunk. That was his act. He would stumble onto stage, slur his words, forget names, lose his train of thought. Audiences loved it because it was so convincing. The problem was that Foster Brooks sometimes used real alcohol to help him get into character. A drink or two before going on stage to warm up, to help him find that loose, fuzzy headspace that made his performance feel authentic. Most of the time it worked perfectly, but occasionally he overdid it. On at least 2 Tonight Show appearances, staff members noted that Brooks had been drinking more than his usual pre-show warm-up. On one particular night, you could see it happen in real time. He started his routine the way he always did, the practiced stumbles and slurs that audiences expected. But then, he slipped out of character mid-bit. The slurring became different somehow, less controlled, more genuine. He lost track of his own routine, the carefully rehearsed beats that he had performed hundreds of times before. Johnny picked up on it immediately. He had been watching Foster Brooks perform that act for years and knew exactly what it was supposed to look like. This was different. This was the real thing bleeding through the performance. Carson shifted into rescue mode without missing a beat. He turned the moment into comedy without embarrassing Brooks, played along like it was all part of the act. The audience never knew the difference, but crew members afterward confirmed what everyone backstage already suspected. Foster Brooks had been playing drunk while also being drunk. The line between performance and reality had completely dissolved. Number 9. Robert Blake. Robert Blake was always intense. That was part of his appeal as an actor, that coiled energy that could explode at any moment. But when Robert Blake had been drinking, that intensity became something else entirely. Something unpredictable and volatile and genuinely uncomfortable to witness. Multiple staffers described his mood on one particular Tonight Show night as liquid courage.
Where have you been, Robert? This is on backwards. I think you were in a hurry or something.
And what followed became one of the tensest interviews Johnny Carson ever conducted. From the moment Blake walked through that curtain, something was off. The audience applauded like always, expecting the usual tough guy charm he brought to talk shows. But within seconds of sitting down, his energy was all wrong. He was bouncing his leg constantly, tapping his fingers on the armrest. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring into the audience like he was daring someone to challenge him. Johnny asked the standard opening question, something harmless about whatever project Blake was promoting. Blake didn't even pretend to answer. Instead, he launched into a story about working as a child actor on studio backlots decades earlier, describing it with this jittery intensity that made the entire room go silent. Then, without any transition, he spun back to the present and started accusing modern actors of never earning their success. It was an attack on his own industry, while supposedly promoting his own movie. Johnny tried to lighten the mood with a joke. Blake didn't even notice. He just kept going like a train with no brakes. Every time Johnny tried to guide the conversation back onto rails, Blake would veer off again. One moment, he was reenacting a fight scene. The next, he was ranting about agents and producers who had no business deciding anyone's future. Johnny raised his eyebrows toward Ed McMahon with that silent look he used when things were slipping out of control.
Did they change this seat around something?
I don't know. Is it feels?
Was there a change made? No.
Ed didn't jump in. He just nodded slightly, acknowledging that they were in trouble. At one point, Blake stood up completely unprompted. The camera operator had to frantically pull focus just to keep him in frame. Carson held up his hands, gently trying to get Blake to sit back down. Instead, Blake leaned over Johnny's desk and launched into another monologue about the pressures of show business. It wasn't angry in a straightforward way. It was scattered, emotional, impossible to predict. People backstage were frozen. Nobody knew if they should cut to commercial early, but Johnny refused to embarrass guests that way unless there was no other choice. He kept asking simple questions, softballs about anything that might reset the tone. Blake swatted everyone away and circled back to anger, to old grudges, to whatever was flashing through his mind. Eventually, Carson managed to squeeze in a polite transition. But Blake kept talking, even as the band started playing for commercial. Johnny stood slowly and placed a hand on Blake's shoulder, communicating they were done without saying it. The audience gave that strange half applause people give when they're not sure what they just watched. After the show, Johnny went straight to his producer. He wasn't angry, just firm. Blake was too unpredictable, too emotional, too much of a wild card when he had been drinking.
For so many decades, Robert Blake, a little guy with a big, tough attitude, was about as well known as most other stars.
A talk show host could work around almost anything. Nervous guests, boring guests, rambling guests, but not a guest who took the show hostage with Volatility. From that night on, there was a standing order. Confirm Blake was sober before confirming the booking. If there was even a hint he had been drinking, reschedule or pass entirely. Some risks just weren't worth taking. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson didn't just host a show. He stood between order and collapse, making split-second decisions that shaped careers and erased others from memory. Every stumble, every slurred word, every forced smile revealed how thin the line really was between legend and liability. And if these moments slipped through on the most carefully managed stage in television history, imagine what never made it past the curtain. The footage we've seen is only what survived. The real question is this: how many careers, secrets, and nights of chaos are still locked away in studio vaults, waiting for the moment they finally come back into the light?